the whole idea of being the change you want to see in the world. And through that experience, which in the end was 3 years, I kind of came to the point where I'm at now with the new book, Drinking Molotov Cocktails with Gandhi, and that whilst I was being the change, I was looking at the world around me and things still getting a lot worse. So I was, growing my own food, foraging, that kind of thing out in the woods. Yet, the oceans are still being bottom trawled at the same rate. Economic growth is still on the rise, for many countries. You've got rainforest being chopped down at an insane rate, and forests in general. So all the kind of environmental devastation was still continuing, and I felt, well, as much as it's important to be the change you want to see in the world, for in terms of being an example and in terms of your own dignity, there's also bigger change required. More political change. And so the latest book is a lot more political in its content.
It struck me from reading the book, there was two main things that struck me. One was quite a picture of the situation in terms of you graphically portray ecocide and a lot of the real horrors of globalization and the effect, what we're actually doing on this planet. So one is the situation, you portray that very well, and the second is thoughts on a solution to that. These were the two aspects. And if we were to look at, for instance, the first part, what we're doing actually on the planet, or to start there, it struck me, one of the things you said at one stage is, at somewhere along the line, is we wouldn't walk into a sweatshop and pay a child slave a $5 for a t-shirt and walk away with that, but because of the distance. And that really struck me as the sense of distance we have from what's actually happening on the planet. We don't see the clear cuts in the forests, we don't see the ecocide, you say something like 100,000 species lost, is it every year or something? And I wonder, your book does something to help us connect to that, but if you were to speak a bit more to that, would be, how do we bridge this gap? The fact that we are disconnected from what's actually happening on this planet.
Yeah, that was exactly the kind of idea behind my Life Without Money in the first place. I came to the realisation that the distance between the producer and the consumer leads to a lot of systemic violence. So as Patrick was saying, you wouldn't go into a sweatshop and pay the owner of the sweatshop for the clothes we wear. Yeah, we're very happy to go onto the nice shiny shop on the main street and get the exact same thing. It would probably be better going straight to the sweatshop to probably get more money for it. And it's the same with everything. It's the same with the food we eat. It's the same with the products we buy. Which of us, when we go into when we're putting in something in our house, we think about the plastics involved. Where that comes from. The oil rigs, the whole system in between producer and consumer. And the greater the distance between producer and consumer, I can guarantee you the greater the systemic violence, the greater the level of ecocide. And so for me, one of the key solutions is for us to relocalise. And I would say these days actually to rewild, because the ultimate in relocalisation is rewilding. I think we need to start the long process of rewilding ourselves and rewilding our communities.
Okay. And even within a localised economy, or even in kind of a more localised system, as you pointed out, a whole other thing, for instance, the copper that's in our plugs, everything like this, we live in a globalised society. So I wonder what needs to be done to actually kind of connect, or do we work in a system that somehow necessitates hypocrisy at some level? You even kind of say the petrol that you use on your way to the protest, how we manage this situation.
Yeah, it's we're all born into this scenario. It's not like we were the first people to create industrialism. We were born here. So in some ways, we've been very unlucky in many ways. I feel personally that I've been robbed of a lot in my life, robbed of things that I've never even experienced. That deep connection to the land that primitive tribal people had. And it was cultural stories and their music and everything was weaved into a culture that was genuinely sustainable. It didn't lay waste to land, didn't pollute the rivers, didn't pollute the air. A genuinely sustainable culture tried and tested over thousands of years. And so in many ways it's how do we, born into this world of industry, find a way back home? It's a very, very big question, and again, for me personally, it's about starting the long process of rewilding myself, but also accepting that there's bigger forces at play now. You know, we're not responding to climate change, and for me, climate change is a Gaian response to what we're doing to the planetary system. You know, it is. You know, we're like the planet isn't that attached to human beings. You know, we're no more special than any other species on the planet as far as it's concerned. And so, unless we can start living with respect to the earth, then at some point she'll have a little, and she'll just shake us off a little bit, and maybe quite karmically it'll be the people who remember to learn in connection, remember to stay in connection with the land in a respectful way that will probably survive what's coming up. But unless we as people kind of, you know, really get serious about the challenges facing us, then we are somewhere down the endangered species list. You know, shortly after bees and other stuff. And, you know, we are on that list, and we need to get very, very serious about that.
Yeah. And while the challenges, in a certain sense, may have actually escalated, the imminence of the danger and so on, I wonder, when you say thinking back, there was more sustainable cultures that you kind of look back with longing at and so on. A question I had from the book was, you portray globalization a bit like a machine, and yet in one way it's quite a simplistic portrayal as a machine versus are there some benefits to modernity in a certain sense, even in terms of, if you look at some of the statistics, there's a lot that could be said to be going right with the world, well, there's a lot to be going hideously wrong with it at equal measure, you know, in terms of equality, in terms of like, it would feel wrong to say the abolition of slavery, because there's obviously slavery on the planet, and slavery of nature, if nothing else. But, you know, some change has come about in human consciousness towards equality at some level.
Yeah, well, I think actually if you look back at studies of more tribal people, the problem is we only go back sometimes a couple of 100 years when we think of like peasant kind of subsistence living, and that's a kind of a fallacy of kind of shifting baseline syndrome. We need to kind of go back a lot longer and look at the people, the communities that I would say are genuinely sustainable, and they had a lot of equality, and actually they're mostly matriarchal societies. You know, we're in a very patriarchal world where it's all run by men, and we as men, we kind of do things in a certain way. And I think we'd actually probably be in a much better state if we had balance between the kind of matriarchal and patriarchal. We've both got something very important to give to the society we're in. And so actually on that basis, yeah, like I think it was very equal a long, long time ago. If you go back 300 years, then we've made big progress in 300 years in some respects. But again, it's whose perspective are you speaking from? Are you speaking from the perspective of the modern human, or are you speaking in terms of the salmon, the wolf? You know, anywhere between 10,000 and 100,000 species a year being wiped out. If you asked one of them, is modernity a good thing? You know, they'd probably be like, no, I wiped my entire species out. You know, so it's a matter of perspective. When we're in a very kind of anthropocentric culture, we can't seem to empathise or relate to other species. And what I'm trying to do with this book is to kind of help us remember that it's not just about humans. You know, I've got no more attachment to human beings than I have to all of life on Earth. You know, so I think we need to start looking at what is best for life, not just what's best for one species on the planet.
Yeah, you give some really good examples in your book of living so closely connected with nature that if you really feel connected to the stream from which you drink, if that's an essential part of your life force, then self-defense has a broader picture than just protection of your own body, that you're part of this web of life. I think that's a lovely point. And yet then maybe if we were to move to that in terms of what you see as effective defense, or what is an effective action to actually protect the planet.
Yeah, I think this was one of the other aspects about living around money was that I really got a real sense of interconnection with the earth around me. Because when you're, as I said in the book, when you're drinking from that stream and you cup the water in your hands and you bring it to your mouth, at what point is at what point is that water, and what point does it become you? Because you're 60% water roughly. Is it when it passes your lips, or is it when it's in your hand, or is it when it's in the stream? You start to really realise that the boundaries of self are a lot more muddled than you've ever imagined. The same with the food you put in. You know, it's your body's full of different nutrients at any one moment, and you're taking carrots and potatoes from the ground and you're putting them inside you. At what point is it you and not you? Very blurry. So the whole idea of self-defence is a kind of a universally understood thing. You know, we have the right to defend self. But if I'm living in connection with the land and somebody comes along and pollutes my land, pollutes my water supply, he's effectively killing me. And this was what tribal people know a lot better than we do, because you know, if you went out to Ogani land in Nigeria and asked, you know, what Shell done to their land, it destroyed their lives. You know, they lived in connection with their land there, and the first thing you do if you want to wipe out a culture is wipe out their basis for living, like water and so on. Start charging them for it then, for what you took away from them. And so you get a sense. So when you connect intimately with these things, you get a sense of them being yourself, and then self-defense is a whole different question. You know.
Yeah, you use the analogy in terms of in the web of life, if we're all one organism, then the organism needs antibodies and needs to actually fight infection in that regard. And I suppose one of the things that seems in the book is you're advocating obviously people have tried to be active and stopping some of the exploitation of both people, animals and the whole ecosystem in different ways. And one of the things that you're pointing to in this book, which is quite radical, or it's not spoken of in most other books, is what you call the use of the full toolkit of a defence, pointing out that in most revolutions and in most acts of change, there's been a variety of means. It hasn't all been non-violent, as is, well, we're kind of into non-violence. So yeah, would you speak about that? Would you really kind of advocating that even Gandhi is portrayed as the ultimate peaceful, the revolution with which he was such an integral part of, but yet you point out there was violence happening alongside it that was part of the agent of change. So you seem to be bordering on advocating violence being part of this. However you define violence.
Just ask the question I was going to ask there. How do you define violence first? That's a very, very big question because, for example, look at that plug socket over there, right? You wouldn't think of that as being a violent act, buying a plug socket, would you? But you show me, anybody in this room tell me how you make that plug socket, and I'll show you how you lay waste to the whole world. Right, so what's violence? You know, what is violence? Most of our entire lifestyle is undermined by systemic violence that makes ISIS look like pussycats. You know, it really is. Like from any other perspective than from a Western white perspective, you know, that is the violence we're doing to the world. And we need to get very, very real about that. So before you can even talk about these things, you've got to first talk about what actually is violence, and how much of it is embroiled in our lives. Secondly, I think that when you're talking about the antibodies, the antibody is a very potent example of this. In our bodies, at any one moment, there's a variety of different, you know, little creatures keeping your body in health. You know, different types of blood cells. You know, you've got bacteria in your gut, and in your body you've got antibodies. You know, the antibodies' role is to attack antigens.
Okay, is there also a danger of promoting violence in a certain regard, however you define promoting violence, without really, I mean, I hear you cautioning it should be the last route, but given that use of force and that the use of, like, when our needs are frustrated, people so often use to, even raising my voice or kind of just somehow powering over you, feels like a quicker way to actually deal with things. But yet, I might get my way, but then the obvious thing is it a lasting change? Or do you brew resentment? And, you know, so without really deeply questioning, and I sense in the book you are deeply questioning the motives, and the people who you give some examples of, they seem to deeply questioning their motives, but Yeah, that was just a thought, is the danger of promoting violence without deeply questioning the motives and doing some internal work before doing something before using force.
Yeah, no, it was a worry of mine too, because I remember a book called Meat by Simon Furley, which kind of, was literally just questioning our meat consumption, and saying we should cut down, and it basically gave rise to lots of people just going back to eating all sorts of kind of factory farmed meat and so on. And I remember having that thought at the time, and George Monbiot coming out, a few months ago and saying that he regrets promoting the book because that's what happened. And so I had a similar thought myself, is this just going to lead to mindless violence? So I guess what I'm arguing against is mindless non-violence. But there's always this kind of worry, but again I would come back to going switch on your TV set when you go home and there's somebody promoting violence, right? So I think my little book's probably the least of our worries in the world. We just don't think of violence. When we're watching an advert for McDonald's, who's thinking hyper violence? You're just thinking you might be a bit miffed with McDonald's. You might not support them, but you're thinking there is a bit of hyper violent propaganda. And yet I'm the one who comes here to do a talk, and I'm talking about actually living in harmonious relationship with the land once again, and defending the land as if it was your own body. And to defending the most vulnerable on the earth, and I'm the one kind of defending myself against whether my statement can lead to violence. It's guaranteed to lead to violence on TV. There's probably a 0.1% chance of mindless violence happening from my talk. So I'd probably want to get McDonald's CEO up here first and see what he's got to say about the matter. Yeah.
Good point. Question is curious about overall how the reactions and response to the book has been. It's a challenging book and it stimulates some really interesting conversations. So you've started conversations that I don't think have been that active yet. So how has the response to the book been, and has it changed your thinking, what has been your response to the response?
Yeah, I guess it was probably of all the three books, it was the only book that I was actually pretty scared about actually releasing, because at first I just thought it's my mum and dad are going to read it. There's some pretty hardcore stuff in there. And my mum and dad are the most lovely people in the world, just simple folk back in Donegal. I was just thinking, God, that's quite worrying in itself. Then all my kind of, alternative friends, who many of them come from very non-violent backgrounds, I just think, am I going to lose a lot of friends because of really challenging certain values? So that was worrying. And what I found just blew me away was the feedback has just been immense. A lot of people just coming up to me going I know, I've not thought about it in those terms, and I've not really felt I could speak about it, but I can't really argue with what, I'm not just sitting and don't have questions or things challenging, but we know things are getting worse and worse, and the things firstly democracy isn't working, and secondly when democracy fails and activism is meant to step in and fill the void that democracy fails on, activism isn't working. Activism is just not working at the moment. And what I found most surprising of all was the opposite of what I thought. I thought I was reading a kind of a book that men would get and women might get a bit miffed about. The total opposite. Women love it for some reason, which I find really, really interesting. And for men, I've got more kind of questions and more kind of challenging aspects, and there's something kind of quite interesting in that as well. But in general terms, the feedback's been it's been unanimously decent up to now. When I was expecting to get kicked out of many events. For what I would say.
There's time yet. I'm aware of our time and our time constraints. Before we move to questions, is there anything last that you'd like to add before we actually just open to the floor?
Nothing majorly, but I would say maybe one of the main points of the book. I talk about changing the 3 R's from reduce, reuse, recycle to resist, revolt, rewild. And because I think that we need to upgrade these things, because reduce, reuse, recycle just isn't working. But as part of that, when I talk about rewilding, I talk about George Monbiot came out in the last couple of years and talked about experiments of putting the wolf back into kind of Yellowstone National Park and so on, and the effect that had on the landscape, really transformed the landscape. And I applied this to the political landscape and realised that there was actually a place for the wolf in the political landscape. So while you need the beaver and you need the salmon and you need the otter and you need all these different types of creatures, the heron, all these different characteristics, there's also a role for the wolf. Because as Aldo Leopold said, the mountain fears deer as much as deer fears wolf. So if you don't have a wolf around, you've got bare mountains, trees can't grow. Nature understands this, but because we civilized humans have been indoctrinated in certain ways and lost our wildness, then we fear the idea of the wolf again, not just in our ecological landscapes, but also in our political landscapes. And we need to get back to thinking about the wolf, reintroducing him, or her. Usually a her, actually.
With hundreds of millions of people in Europe, how do you propose to rewild everyone, or is this specifically for a particular group who will live outside the constraints of normal society which will keep going on? Are we talking about a universal rewilding, particularly of Western?
Yeah, I think it's up to us all individually to, if we want to rewild, then to start that process off. In terms of rewilding London, for example, it's probably impossible. Like, it would be my personal view that that the city structure is inherently unsustainable, and therefore, by definition, it will come to its own demise at some point. As sad as that is for all of us, because nobody wants to see, the kind of devastation that will come with that. But I think we have to prepare ourselves for a rewilded future, and when we're teaching our kids and when we're educating our kids, and then to start bringing that element into it, because that should be a part of our future, a more rewilded future. And the more of those kind of skills that we can hold, we've lost so many of them, and the more of these things that we can hold on to, they're like little seeds that will actually sprout when the big dead trees fall, and the big dead trees will fall as a matter of time. It's just that can we retain enough of the building blocks of life until that point comes. This is what I think is really good about the idea of rewilding as well. It's not like we're not going to rewild all of Ireland and Britain in the next 10 years, but what we can do is protect as much of the building blocks of life as possible, because once the inevitable does happen, and it will happen in my opinion, is again as sad as that is, then there is the basics for life to thrive again, and humans will probably be a really healthy part of that, I hope.
I think we could wave goodbye to half the population of Europe.
We wave goodbye to half the population of Europe.
Is that what you're saying? Will we wave goodbye?
To the half the population of Europe, because the very density of population that we have are sustained by the intensive agriculture that we have. So, I mean, even if we disagree with it, to try and loosen that and to expand that, it can't sustain what we have. So I'm just wondering, who do we jettison, who do we ditch, and who can rewile?
I'm not, there's a Finnish guy called Pentti Linkola. I'm definitely not Pentti Linkola. I don't really talk about jettisoning people, but yeah, I think that we, like in these kind of times, what we should be doing is being as gentle and loving to each other as we possibly can, because there's a strong possibility it's going to get messy over the next 50 years. We're looking at 200 million climate refugees by 2050. That's probably the best case scenario. Things are going. If you look at it from any realistic, honest perspective, it's not looking good. And so I think one of the best things we can do is like look after each other, and then what will happen will happen. And how we deal with each other, and that will probably be the making of us or the death of us. So I would say look after each other as much as we can. Start building the world we want right now, and hopefully that will provide a seed for a future. Something more beautiful will actually arise out of the earth instead of the kind of industrial machine.
Mark, I found your book both very challenging and very disturbing. The challenging part, I think Patrick has very adequately explained. I mean, it is a book that for me awakens me at a much deeper level to the violence that we're inflicting by our very lifestyle on the planet and the ecosystem. In fact, as I was saying to Patrick earlier, it reminds me of a reaction I had to some of the most beautiful sections of the Pope's encyclical about biodiversity, which are poetic in my view, and which again awaken me to something that I probably haven't been sufficiently awakened to. So thank you for that. I mean, it is a very, very challenging book. However, I think that your posing of the issue of effectiveness in terms of violence versus non-violence disturbed me greatly. I have to say that, and it comes in at the very beginning of the book. It's not a sub-theme. It is the dominant theme in the book, as you introduce it from the beginning, in my view. And to be honest with you, it seems to me that it's the wrong question, and that's why it disturbs me. The question of effectiveness is the real question, and perhaps in terms of effective actions that we have to allow ourselves to contemplate elements of controlled destructiveness of institutions, destructiveness even of buildings. But when we pose it in terms of violence, non-violence, and I think you at times dangerously portray non-violence almost as a strategy of the powerful to keep us ineffective, I worry that it's leading on a slippery slope, which, when we see the state of the world today, we can see how it leads to some really terrifying action. So that's really my fundamental question to you. I'm struck also by your question of releasing the wolf into politics, and I'd love to know in practical terms how we might do that, since we're going to have a general election next March. So I'd love to release the wolf into Irish politics.
Yeah, I guess when you're saying around you're being disturbed by the idea of terming it in terms of violence and non-violence, it's like as I described in the book, I really questioned about what actually is violence in the first place. So it's almost really difficult to have this discussion where I've really gone in depth into what violence is. And so I totally, I totally respect that opinion, and I have similar concerns myself. But we are already on the slippery slope. We entered the really slippery slope about 200 years ago, and I think we are in denial about the violence of our culture. And so I really hope that nobody takes from the book that the main theme is that we should go out and be violent. It's not at all. I think we should go out and be non-violent. But what non-violence is complex. We've been for too long putting violence downwards, and it is about being effective. And being effective is a complex question in itself, because you've got to think about what's long-term effective as well. Like, you can have a kind of a revolutionary short-term effectiveness, and then it turns into the same long-term. That's been shown throughout history also. So I share some of your concerns, and I understand your point. It's something I thought long and hard about myself. But I do think that we need, I think it would take me 30 minutes just to talk about the whole concept of violence in the first place, just to kind of, as a precursor to what I might say. So I don't really feel I can respond in the time frame that's what the book, I suppose, is really. And you're right. I'm glad you're disturbed with the book, because I'd be more worried if you weren't a bit disturbed. Part of the purpose of the book is to disturb us into a reaction of some sort. Because we simply can't go on. You know this as well as me, Pater. What we're doing isn't working, and I really hope what people get from the end of the book is that I really want us to respond non-violently. But we really have to question what that looks like, what that means. It's not a book. The very first line is saying this book is not advocating violence. It's just advocating a different form of non-violence. And including the entirety of life in her thing. And just coming back to that, would you, if I wrote a book about how to make a plug, would you say that was a violent book? Would you be disturbed by that book? You probably wouldn't. Be about making.
I'll tell you when you write.
I'm not an electrician, so. But nobody would, if I was a man up here talking about how you make plug sockets, we'd just be having a little nice conversation. Nobody would be challenged about it. But when we start talking about a slightly different form of violence, that's actually probably a lot less violent, because it's actually protecting those most vulnerable. then it kind of stirs up lots of stuff, and I found it really interesting because that plug socket is more violent than anything I've said in the book, and yet it has this reaction. It's not about that. It's not that you shouldn't go and use your laptop tomorrow. It's that in 50 years' time, do we want to create a world that's a techno utopia, or do we want to create a world that's a rewilding world? And without asking those questions, you get totally different results. And so yeah, if you're like myself, like I use a laptop to write books about not using laptops, So you can do what you can do in the world today and do it to the best you can. Just constantly challenge and question yourself.